From tracking cabs to clouds, have you thought about how location data has become an integral part of our everyday lives? If you're interested in knowing the science of location better, our Introduction to Geospatial Science and Technology course is the perfect starting point for you. Designed for curious minds from all disciplines, perfect for newcomers and working professionals, this course unpacks the science and real world applications behind geospatial technology. Don't miss the chance to learn from the best in the field. Applications closing on 7 June.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Things Policy. And here we have an interesting chat planned for the day. I have Shambhavi Naik with me. She chairs the Advanced Biology program at the Takshashila Institution. I am Ashwin Prasad. I work as a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program. And considering that I have a technology background and Shambhavi has a background in core science, I thought it would make for an interesting conversation to explore what these streams mean for an individual and also on a broader context for the institutions in our country and for the country itself. Welcome, Shambhavi.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Ashwin. Nice to be here. Really looking forward to this debate.
All right. So right now, the world we live in today is the technology and science have an outsized impact on the way we do things, right? The economic prosperity of countries are deeply linked to technology, and this technology also emerges from in some form or the other from sciences and research. And so there is a lot of synergy here, but there is also competition because the allocation of resources, energies, and time to these two streams is not always equal, and if one is getting more attention, inevitably the other will get lesser attention. And so Shambhavi, what are your thoughts? So when we are trying to talk about core sciences and technology, first, for the sake of clarity, how do you differentiate the two?
I have a PhD in cancer biology, right? I come from that field of following science for the just curiosity perspective, just to know, right? Having said that, I got into science because I wanted to cure cancer. So there was always that pursuit of knowledge for some reason. In my case, it was for trying to find a cure for cancer. But I think at its core, science is about understanding everything around us, right? I come from the biology field, and I think a lot of technology, a lot of what humans aspire to do is to imitate biology. And we want to fly like the birds. Obviously, we have created different technologies because we have not been able to harness biology to have wings, etc. But a lot of what we aspire is things that we see around us, and we want to also be able to do, right? And to be able to do that, we need to understand how those things have evolved to happen in a certain way. And science at the core is trying to understand that. It's trying to understand the universe around us. It is not seeking actively publications. It is not actively always seeking to better humanity or better environment. It is just, for me, it's a pure knowledge generation of what it is and how do things happen, around us. Technology is obviously the layer on top. When we understand how things happen around us and we want to change something, we apply that knowledge. We then obviously use other knowledge. It is not then just biology knowledge, right? It is other things that we also understand together to create this layer of application, right? So for me, science is just a pure pot of knowledge, and then technology is on top of it. You build on layers. You add all the tadka and the masala, and you make a nice tea out of it. That's technology. But yeah, I'm happy to hear if even you have another perspective on the difference. So for me, all technology comes from science, but not all science will lead to technology. What do you think, Ashwin?
That's a very good summary of the whole thing. I agree with you for the most part because It is the origin of technology does come from science, and technology is just applying that science, optimizing its use cases, and productionizing it in a sense. And I also feel like science is without judgment, while technology, we try and make it serve a purpose, and we hold it to some standards. We try and enforce those standards, and but with science, you're going in with a sense of curiosity, and with a sense of just trying to understand and find answers to sometimes questions that we don't even know exist. And in that sense, it's without any judgment, and therefore it is without any bias also. And I think in the technological world today, we see this playing out in various ways. And so, because of the different nature of a person trained in technology and a person trained in core sciences, there are, because of the nature of these two streams, there is some difference in the way that it will generate thinking, or it will have an impact on the the work that the person does itself, right? So what do you think these differences are between a technocrat who's primarily focused on technology and a core scientist, like you are, who was involved in inquiry? I mean, in the real world, it would be a mix of the two. It would not be separate. But I just, for the sake of the discussion, I think it's worth.
Yeah, there'll be a mix of the two also. As a even as a scientist, you obviously always have a question that you want to answer, right? Nobody goes to a lab and says, okay, today let us see what experiments we can do, right? So we always, for your PhD thesis, or I mean, currently the world of science is governed a lot by what publication houses want than what scientists want, right? So what would be my next article about, what kind of experiments or story would fit a particular journal that I want to target, right? So there is some outlining of what you want to achieve. It is not completely free space. But even within that, there is a lot of space. Let me just say that again. But even within that, there is a lot of space for sidetracking, right? So one of the things that all master students, all PhD students, when you start research, are told is, um, don't sidetrack from what you're doing, because when you're actually just very curious about something, you do an experiment, and your result can lead you to 10 different directions. And then the question is, how do you go down to just a two or three of the most relevant ones that you should be doing? And I don't think technocrats have any freedom when it comes to, I did something, I found out, hey, this, I know this is the point that we want to go ahead, but this other thing that I saw is also interesting, can I try and look at that? But within a technocratic position, when especially if you are in a for-profit company, that door is automatically shut, um, which I think is unfortunate. A lot of academicians that I know of will always be like, be very judgmental of private research, because for that reason, right? No, you won't be able to, you won't have your freedom of doing what you want to do, etc. I think that obviously impacts thinking in a way. On the flip side, obviously, as an academician, you always think that, okay, I want to do so much, but I have only so many resources. So where do I spend them? I can't be doing everything under the sun. So that's, I think, also reflects on the thinking of academicians. There is some nobility that academicians do tend to associate with themselves, because they are not in research for profit purposes. They're there just to push the barriers of knowledge. Um, I don't know whether necessarily that's a good thing, um, but it does. In my personal opinion, I've seen it quite a bit. Um, in the technocrat world, because you are so focused on solving a particular problem, I think you might have leads to other solutions which you can easily ignore, because it's that question might not be important to you right now, and I think the world might end up losing on some really good solutions because of that. I mean, for example, a lot of our I think the two most um, famous biology based technologies that we have right now, CRISPR technology and the mRNA vaccine platform, were both, um, fundamental research for both of them was done in US universities many years ago, and it was just considered science, and it was considered, well, we have the science, we have this knowledge, what do we do with it? And it was just sitting on a shelf for a long time, right? Slowly being built on, um, till we reached the stage where now CRISPR is actually curing thalassemia and sickle cell anemia in humans. And obviously, the mRNA vaccine platform became very famous during COVID because we were able to quickly deploy it for the creation of vaccines. But if you think about it, if this was a technocrat who was saying, let's look for vaccines, I don't think they would have gone looking for mRNA in bacteria, right? So I think that really impacts the way you think about creating knowledge itself and its use.
So, considering this this balance between the two, there is a lot of impact in the way individuals and societies make career decisions that will eventually snowball into research projects and allocation of funds and finally outputs in a country. And right now there is I feel like there is an imbalance, at least in India, in the way people perceive uh, sciences versus a technological career. And so, what can we do, and how should people think about this choice at an individual and a societal level about what they should perceive, what they should pursue, and how they should think about it? Do you have any thoughts?
So I think one thing that is quite apparent is over the past many years, I think globally there has been a shift to more investments in technology, and that, I mean, if you think about it, it is it is quite clear why this might be. We are, I mean, everybody is in an economic race, right? Um, we recently had all of this controversy about, India becoming the fourth largest economy. Does that really matter? Is GDP per capita important, etc., etc.? Technology obviously plays two very important roles. A, it obviously pushes your economy because technology can be leveraged financially. But B, also a lot of technology is about uplifting standard of living, right? It could be healthcare, it could be AI, it could be mechanics. A lot of technology is actually just about uplifting the standard of living for people. And therefore, it makes sense for why countries would invest in technology. On the other hand, I think a few decades ago, when we were discovering, when we were pushing the barriers for knowledge. So, for example, when we understood about DNA in the 1950s, 1960s, um, the the transition from science to technology then was rapid, right? Because it was just unprecedented amount of knowledge that we were breaking into with every breakthrough that we were making, right? So when we started to learn how to read the genome, for example, um, initially when we understood that the amount of knowledge that was created and the amount of technology that can be based on it was huge. What we have been seeing now for the past few years is perhaps a bit of stagnation, um, because we haven't really had those breakthrough science, that would leapfrog us into, this is a completely new stream of domain of knowledge that we can build technology on. And I think one of the things that reflects on is the fact it takes now years to actually publish any fundamental science work, um, because papers will be like, huh, but you're not really pushing knowledge. And we are kind of stuck in that cycle of trying to seek better and better knowledge. But because technology has now rapidly moved, that transition has slowed down a bit. And so it is obvious that a lot of countries will feel that, hey, why should we spend more on science? Because the value of spending more on science in terms of getting technology out and making economic sense is perhaps lesser. So let us just build on new and new technologies. But obviously, science is not just about creating economic value. Science, there is more societal value, there is more human capital value to why we should have more science investments in the country. And we can talk about that later. Um, but there is economic sense that is very apparent with doing technology, and I think it also reflects on the salaries that people get. Right, so a technologist salary would likely be higher than a scientist salary. And therefore, you would choose to do technology. It's supposed to be hot. You will immediately have thousands of courses around a particular technology the minute the technology picks up. Um, You'll have a huge global narrative pushing for a technology. Semiconductors right now, everybody, you go into a village in India and you talk semiconductors and they'll probably have an opinion on it, right? And so it becomes very alluring to someone who's starting out that, look, this is where it is. The thing about technology, though, to be very, very about is that technologies change rapidly. So what might seem to be a really good hot topic to be in right now might not be in 10 years, right? In 10 years, some other technology might come in. I mean, everybody right now is afraid of AI, right? What AI will do to jobs, etc. And tomorrow we might discover something completely different. And people will say, hey, we don't need AI anymore. We'll use this other technology. Then what will you do? So I think of when you think about it from a career perspective as well, there are some basic lessons that you learn when you do fundamental research that remain applicable even for technology. Um, but learning about technologies gives you a bit of agility uh, that perhaps science doesn't afford you. Learning about pure science doesn't afford you. So what we really need is a mix of the two, to be able to question something, and be able to make the right choices once you have asked those questions, but also not to get sidetracked and to stay focused. Perhaps those are the two things that we can learn from the two domains.
Before you dive into what the government or the economic forces behind these sectors can do, I also want to ask you, what are the other positive offshoots or just offshoots coming out of this in terms of human capital or societal values? Can you expand on that?
Sure, I think one of the core things. I mean, we often hear about this about scientific temper,
Mm,
and scientific method. The idea of questioning everything
mm,
without a bias,
mm,
keeping an open mind, etc. They are quite rooted in this idea that if I want to learn something about nature, I cannot go in thinking that, hey, this is what nature does, and I think this is how it does it, and therefore it has to be correct, right? Then with that approach, I'll never learn about anything. To be able to inculcate that not just for your scientific experiments but in your everyday life, is quite helpful, like just basic critical thinking. And the scientific method, I think, is the best way to learn about it. And to have centers within our cities, within our villages, where those conversations happen, right? Where someone says that, hey, look, the earth is flat, and someone else then comes and says, hey, but where is your evidence that the earth is flat? Here is our evidence that on why the earth is not flat. It automatically uplifts the kind of conversation that happens in those communities, right? When you have critical thinkers come and say give public talks, right? So I studied at the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore, and we often used to have these public talks, uh, where people used to come, and it was used to be open to the public to come and listen to them, right? um, these talks which would then push what was considered boundaries sometimes, uh, to even, just to raise questions, not always have answers, but to raise questions on, why do we do things in a certain way, right? um, I think those are great for just improving the kind of conversations that happen. uh, Second, obviously, you have infrastructure, etc. So then, the other students, etc., in your communities can also learn more about research skills. They can get exposed to infrastructure, which is not always present. So, um, in terms of just obviously pure scientific progress, but apart from that, I think there's great societal value for why those science centers need to be embedded within our society. They can't be away. Uh, One of the things that we often scientists are often accused of is being in ivory towers. Um, but over the past few years, I feel that those walls are coming down. There is a lot more of science and society interactions happening as they should. And I think from there we can the idea of critical thinking can really flow out from, say, premier research institutions to universities and colleges and schools, and then to the general public as well.
You mentioned earlier in your chat that the the scientific community often has a non-profit mindset, and that
The
might not
academic
all.
community, yes.
Yeah, the academic community has a non profit mindset, and that's not always a good thing. So is there a case for driving this forward using profit as a motive, and what is the scope of doing that, commercializing research and creating incentives as a force to drive this. And in the same context, how can private companies play a role here, and what can governments do? I'm sure there's a lot of market failures in terms of positive externalities, and how the government can come in and fill that gap. What are your thoughts about these?
Okay. So one of the things that the Indian government has been pushing for decades now is this idea of a public-private partnership, right? In research, for technology, etc. That for some reason, at least in biology, has not really taken off in India. In other countries, so I did my PhD in the UK, right? We had a lot of PhD positions, say in the university where I studied, which was sponsored by the industry, or we had a lot of apprenticeship positions that were offered for our PhD students or master students to go and work in an industry elsewhere. Those kind of linkages are yet to mature. And this is India biotech that I study mostly, right? So that's where that experience comes from. There is a lot of scope for that, because again, science is great for its pursuit. It is even better when it can raise its own funding, right? It doesn't have to be actively involved on government funding. Um, Not all science will lead to technology, but there is always a chance that some science will. And whenever a laboratory notices that something can be commercialized, if they can work with a private industry, or offshoot something of their own to raise funding and non-government funding to be able to actually create a technology, that would be great. Um, it is obviously risky, because even when you see a proof of concept at the fundamental research level, whether the technology they actually succeed is a whole different ball game. But given that there are possible gains at the end, it should be possible to raise private money to actually take that risk, right? To bet on that risk. That we have not, as a country, India has not been able to do very well yet. And I think that space is slowly maturing. We are seeing, at least within the venture capitalist industry, a lot more understanding of wanting to support biotech based research. I'm sure for some of the other technologies, there's a lot of funding already available. So I think we leapfrog in some areas, but we don't in others. Um, I think where the private sector can really come in is to define what kind of questions they want to solve, and perhaps also um, broaden the kind of ambitions that they have. Not just target, say, the domestic market, but also the global market, and how can we create solutions that will impact everybody, etc. Uh, in terms of the funding that they can give, IP sharing, I think, is a real problem area that a lot of the industry faces, because again, the academia would like to have some of the IP that is being generated, because for them, they might be major contributors to the knowledge base. And most issues that I've seen so far is when it comes to this IP sharing problem, and I don't know why it can't be resolved more smoothly than the cases that I've seen so far. Um, and I think that's where the government can also perhaps step in and create some sort of structure around IP sharing. But I think for science and technology both to progress, public-private partnership is the best way forward, because the government obviously can step in. The government funds a lot of R&D that happens in India, but it's not the best value for its money either. It makes sense when you're looking at risky research, foundational research, etc., for blue sky projects for the government to come and step in, or for defense or military related things. But for a lot of the other projects, the academia should be able to raise money from private players, especially for those where there is easy path to technological products, right? And I think that kind of linkage has been missing. It has been pointed out, for by many of the science, technology, and innovation policies that India has come up with over the past many decades. Yet that problem kind of continues to persist. So I think the government can fund a lot of the base infrastructure, for example, which it does. I mean, yes, everybody argues that R&D spending in India is poor, and it is. We have argued at Takshashila earlier that India should be spending at least 3% of GDP on R&D. It doesn't. It's less than 1%. Even from that, most of the budget remains underutilized, and we would like to see at least that being spent better. But we can't keep on relying on the government to give money. When we say India has to spend 3% GDP, it doesn't mean the Indian government has to spend 3% GDP. It means everybody, including the private sector. So hopefully we'll have money coming soon. From an India perspective, actually, I believe that now that the rest of the world has kind of moved away from science and is spending a lot more on technology, uh, if India now spends on some core sciences, and again, obviously, I'm biased to biotech, so I will talk about biotech. I mean, the US, for example, has now slashed a lot of funding for basic science, for health research, etc. That really opens up that area. So, if we make some breakthrough fundamental research now in health sciences, that can very rapidly take us to new technologies and economic value, right? And so we should be looking at those areas where we think that now for the next 4, 5, 10 years, if we fund and shore up resources for some fundamental sciences, we would be the leaders in those technologies in the next 20 years. So we can't only be caught up in this whole semiconductor AI race. We also have to think about what technologies we will need in, say, 20 years' time.
Well, yeah, that was very insightful, Shambhavi. And while we were discussing this, the usefulness of pursuing core sciences in the world today, one more thought struck me that while there are export controls on technology, including AI models, AI chips, there is ITAR that restricts a lot of missile technology exports and imports. Science can also actually be a way to make the world more collaborative. I mean, at least in the space sector which I follow, there are so many instances where countries are so confrontational and the world is divided along adversarial lines. But then there is some form of collaboration that breaks through this because it is scientific, and the benefits of shared discovery often outweigh the the need for adversarial positions, right? For instance, the International Space Station was, I mean, set up during the Cold War era with countries spanning multiple continents and included Russia and the US. And similarly, the James Webb Telescope that they recently sent, which is responsible for most of the amazing photos we get of the universe, actually is a joint effort between multiple countries. And same thing, even China and the US, on at least the scientists collaborate on lunar questions related to lunar surface and the fragments that they have brought back from the moon missions, from the Chinese missions recently. So these are, I think, this is a good uniting force for humanity when it is when it is confronted with a lot of adversarial confrontations. And thank you, Shambhavi. Any closing thoughts before we
Yeah, I
end this
thought that
episode?
was very, very nice way to sum up, Ashwin. You're right. We are. I mean, technology can also create a lot of barriers. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, everybody was singing praises about S400, and yes, it was defense, but it was a technology, and technology. I think to that extent, all technologies are dual use now. So it can be used for very bad purposes. They can be used for really good purposes. But I think fundamental science at its core, the whole discovery about the universe, has to be a force of good. It has to be about joining and just shared human curiosity about what we can do to make things better, not just for us but for everybody. The filter that goes on top of it is sometimes confusing and can be more human centric than not. But I thought that was a very, very nice way of summing up that you have to understand that we are all in this together, and we will all survive if we all survive together.
Well, thank you, Shamavi. That was a very fun episode and a very fun conversation to engage in. There is actually a fundamental duty in the Indian Constitution. I think it's Article 51, which says
Don't
that
know. No,
each one of us has to develop scientific temper,
no,
humanism.
no, Ashwin, no. See, I have a big problem with that
Why?
because the preamble of the Indian Constitution says that I have a right to faith.
Okay.
right? So I can believe in whatever nonsense I want to believe it because I have a right to faith.
Hmm.
So then you come and say that, look, but there's scientific temper, so you can't believe in your, superstitions because they're superstitions. Um, so, so the constitutional duties part, right, was put in
Okay.
during the time of emergency,
Yes.
and it is a good to have, right? I
Hmm.
mean, I agree. I fundamentally agree that everybody should have a scientific temper,
Hmm.
but the whole idea about the constitution is that it allows me the right to live the way I want to, as long as I'm not harming somebody else, right? And faith and my religion is part of that. So while I think it is nice to say that people should question the origins of their faith, etc., I think there is a more fundamentally important place given to that right than the idea of scientific temper. And so I think people who have true scientific temper should question why there should be scientific temper in the constitution.
I'd like to challenge that, at least in some sense, because I feel like so basically the whole thing is that it encourages scientific temper, humanism, spirit of inquiry, and reform. And taking it on the whole and not just with the part, I think it needn't be mutually exclusive. That you can try and develop some scientific temper, inquiry, and a spirit of inquiry, and also be religious or believe in your faith. And it may not always even be in the same, it might not even always be consistent, but it's okay to hold two divergent viewpoints and opinions, and consider them both in their own.
It is. I mean, look, I'm a scientist, I'm a deeply religious person. Okay. And I am completely okay with that idea that
Hmm.
I have two conflicting persons within me. But I don't want a third person to use that
Yeah.
and say that, look, you are duty bound to question your faith. Right? I don't want a third person.
Hmm.
I don't want a constitution to give a third person that idea that they can come and question me and why I might be practicing some faith.
Hmm.
Right? Because the constitution has given me that right that I can practice my faith.
Hmm.
Right? So I don't want the third person to be using that, hey, but it's your duty to question your faith, right? I'm okay with questioning my faith and I'm okay with that idea. But what
Hmm.
Article 51A does is actually give someone else also that right to then come and say that, hey, but you're duty bound to be doing this. You're duty
Hmm.
bound to think about why your faith occurs in some way. And
Hmm.
no, really I'm not, because one of the fundamental rights that the constitution gives me is the idea that I can practice my faith.
Hmm.
So
Well, I think the common
it's a
denominator here.
much better note to end this podcast on.
No, we can at least agree that it is a good to have,
It is
and whether we, yeah,
which is,
whether
I
we,
mean, that entire section is just a good to have. So
yeah, and it's there is a, I mean, it's for a reason. I guess it's not legally enforceable. So, all right.
yeah.
Thanks, Shambhavi. This was a
Thanks, Ashwin.
very fun and interesting conversation. I came away learning a lot of things. I hope our listeners do too. Shambhavi has also written a really nice article outlining these ideas, which I will link in the show notes. Until next time, Shambhavi, take care.
Thanks, Ashwin. Thank you, everybody.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.